Welcome to ShadowTalk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Brandon Tirado, Director of GreyMatter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, a cyber threat intelligence analyst. And today we're really continuing from our show from last week around APTs. However, today we're really diving into Iranian-aligned threat groups, specifically the attack surface that they're actively exploiting, the one that's hiding inside the platforms and business relationships your organization trusts every single day.
John, if there's one conversation that I kind of see dominating in the security realm right now, it's the Iranian-aligned threat actors, right? You know, in March, an Iranian-aligned group wiped 200,000 devices at a U.S. medical device manufacturer in a single coordinated strike. Again, no ransom, just total deliberate destruction at scale.
Yeah, it seems like that's all over the news right now. And what's really concerning is the method behind it, as it changes the calculus for defenders. So the threat actors compromised Microsoft Intune, a legitimate device management platform, and ultimately weaponized it against the very organization that depended on it. This caused destruction and exposed sensitive data.
Yeah, and here's the part I think a lot of organizations haven't really fully processed yet, right? There's a tendency to assume that, you know, if your company has no direct ties to a particular region, you know, in this case, the Middle East, you're simply not on that target list. But, you know, data shared across organizations has the potential to open up an attack vector when exposed. So the real question isn't whether you're geopolitically involved, it's who has privileged access to your environment and how well you can see that and what they're doing with it.
That's becoming increasingly clear, and it's what makes this threat so difficult to defend against. These attackers combine genuine technical sophistication with a sharp eye for foundational gaps that most organizations still haven't closed.
And that's exactly what we're breaking down today. We'll walk through the three major risks from Iranian-aligned threat groups: large-scale destruction, supply chain and third-party exploitation, and targeted attacks against our executives. And more importantly, what organizations can actually do to get ahead of it. So let's start with the landscape. What are we actually dealing with in terms of these Iranian cyber threat operations right now? John, passing it off to you. Catch us up. What's going on here?
Sure, Brendan. Let me give you a lay of the land around the different threat actors we're seeing. So we've seen a few major ones. I think the one on everyone's name is going to be a group known as Handala. They've recently conducted large-scale destruction, data theft, and ultimately VIP doxing. There's also the other major threat of muddy water, and they've been directly targeting U.S. companies. But let's begin with that one that everyone's aware of, which was Handala's targeting of a medical device manufacturer. So as you mentioned, their attack led to the destruction of 200,000 devices. The threat actors also claimed to steal over 50 terabytes of data. And Handala stated this was all done in response to recent Israeli attacks in Iran and due to the manufacturer's association with Israel. But a key element of Handala's playbook is that they use commercial-grade malware, and specifically the information stealer Radamanthus, which they have made a core part of their attacks. Handala has also recently doxed specific VIPs back in December of 2025. They posted on their data leak site the personal information that was taken from cell phones of key Israeli officials, journalists, and business executives. The data released included contact information, photos, and videos. So the next most active Iranian nation-state aligned actor to be aware of is Muddy Water, also known as Seedworm. And they've been spotted on the networks of multiple U.S. companies, including a bank, an airport, a nonprofit, and the Israeli operations of a software company. Muddy Water's access to these companies began back in February of 2026. And I think that's the really worrying part here, as APTs like Muddy Water really aren't waiting for the conflict to start. You know, the major escalation happened here at the end of February, beginning of March. And the APTs, they're getting the footholds ahead of time to exploit them when the time is right. All right, Brandon, passing back over to you. So we know that Handala was able to wipe those 200,000 devices like we mentioned, but how are they able to do this?
Yeah, and John, so like as you mentioned earlier, they weaponized Microsoft Intune, you know, the enterprise device management platform. And once they compromised admin credentials for Intune, they had a kill switch for the entire managed device fleet. Simultaneously, that destruction across every geography, every business unit. And the key component there is they had valid admin credentials. If you've been following along the last few weeks, we've been breaking down our 2026 annual threat report. And like we stated in that report, attackers are arriving with privileged credentials from the start. And that's exactly what took place here. Often these privileged credentials are purchased off the dark web, stolen through phishing, or even information stealing malware. And we know Handala uses the commercial information stealer, Radamanthus, as a core component of its attack, stealing credentials and sensitive data from compromised endpoints. And this is likely how they obtain the medical manufacturer's admin credentials. As security researchers in the community have been reporting finding these exposed credentials in actual information stealer logs.
And Brandon, I'm going to interrupt you right there. Radamanthus, that name rings a bell. Wasn't that the malware that was using AI for data analysis back in 2024?
Yeah, exactly. It was. Back then, the malware was using it to eliminate some of the, the low effort, high time work and make their operations faster by using data analysis to find the valuable artifacts on the actual endpoints they've infected, like crypto wallets. But you interrupted me at a good point because, we need to restate that. Radamanthus, that information stealer, had this AI functionality since 2024. It has likely evolved since then to find other valuable artifacts like admin passwords and even personal information. And we could say that Handala is almost certainly using AI through Radamanthus to enhance their attack capabilities.
Yeah, that's a great point. So another worrying takeaway from the Handala attack was that they likely stole 50 terabytes of data from that medical device company. Brandon, what's your read on why that's so dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, it expands Handala's potential attack surface and opens the door for more third party attacks to begin with against organizations that are associated with that original target. The medical device company did business with many other organizations, and there may be access points to those companies with the captured data. Originally the risk to organizations from these Iranian aligned actors, they seem to be more focused on, or at least we thought, critical infrastructure like energy, defense, and healthcare. But that's definitely shown to be expanding. And Iranian aligned actors, namely hacktivists like Handala, are wanting to just cause chaos in any way possible. Also, aside from the hacktivist angle, in similar fashion, there is an expanding reality of supply chain risk here. Muddy Water, as you had mentioned, John, they also targeted a US-based software company, which could be another open door to affect companies downstream.
And I'm going to double down on that. Recently, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, they threatened to attack major software companies, specifically calling out Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and NVIDIA. These are all global organizations, and that could open the door to even more supply chain attacks.
Exactly. And, right now, it's critical for every organization to understand where that risk lies. So that the final, major risk to call out is around, company brand and reputation damage. As we mentioned, Handala has doxed key Israeli VIPs, releasing personal information about them to cause reputational damage towards that organization and encourage follow-on attacks. This is a fundamental part of their playbook. It's much easier to pull off than, say, a destruction attack or a data theft operation. So there's a strong likelihood, that these Iranian-aligned actors will use this playbook against executives at U.S. businesses in the future. So we've outlined the threats and the largest gaps, Iranian-aligned actors are exploiting. But the question is, how do you close these gaps before the next attack finds them? That's exactly what we're getting into right after this quick break.
ShadowTalk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, GreyMatter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
We're back. Before the break, we laid out how Iranian-aligned actors attack organizations. Now let's talk about what defenders can actually do. We mentioned that Handala likely used an information stealer to steal administrative credentials. What does that mean, John, for you, organizations that are trying to defend this?
Yeah, so I think a key piece of that puzzle was really the possibility of them using AI through Adamanthus. And they likely use it to quickly categorize the stolen data to find what would be most impactful in their attack. It really helped them sort through the noise. There's a massive amount of data that can be captured by these information stealers. And they used it to get the valuable components, things like admin credentials at a specific target organization, quickly out of that noise. Another important element here is that Radamanthus had AI back in 2024, like you mentioned, 2 years ago. This is really another harsh reminder that organizations who are not leveraging AI are way behind the threat actors. It's critical to enhance the capabilities of defenders and keep pace with the threat. Another key piece of the puzzle is that credentials that are stolen through information stealers are often posted for sale on criminal forums and are exposed for months at a time. Risk monitoring solutions here can identify when these credentials are exposed on the dark web. Then you can build automations off the back of them to automatically reset credentials when they're exposed and eliminate a lot of the risk. So, Brendan, there's a serious threat of third-party and supply chain attacks to organizations like we mentioned. Can you break down the fundamental areas of risk within that and how organizations defend?
Yeah, so the main risk elements are really centered around, the data and the connections that each organization shares with said affected third party. Specifically, the data, the hosts, and accounts shared by both. So, on the data part, the data sovereignty becomes a real issue here, right? It's impossible to detect when your data, which is held, again, in this case, by another organization, is compromised. But the risk is the brand reputation damage when that data is not exposed. And now the detection opportunity comes when the threat actors release the data on the dark web, oftentimes through forums and data leak sites like you mentioned, John. And like exposed credentials, a risk monitoring tool that can look for exposed data from these third parties to ensure your response team is notified when that data is posted is key. Next is the threat of actors pivoting to your environment from the compromised organization's connection to yours. And this is often done through shared hosts like jump boxes and accounts the compromised organization used or uses within your environment. And here's the problem, right? We usually can't see what's happening on these shared assets. They live in a gray space between your security program and theirs. And inevitably, this becomes nobody's responsibility until it's everybody's incident. So a proper asset management tool that's going to scan all assets, right, on your network, in between your network, to look not just for the vulnerabilities, right, but also for the critical logging gaps, like the lack of EDR coverage as an example. Then, once identified, it should compile all the affected hosts into something like a case that can be quickly assigned and worked through.
So to restate what you're saying there, Brandon, a good tool will do all the time-intensive legwork here of identifying those gaps and consolidating them so the security team can easily remediate them.
Yep, that's it, John. Exactly. So, finally, we highlighted earlier the risk of Iranian threat actors releasing personal information on executives to cause some of these follow-on attacks and cause brand damage. So, John, how would you say organizations are best set up to defend this threat?
Well, Brandon, it's very similar to what we've already been outlining and the threats that we've already categorized. Often the data stolen is from personal devices or accounts that organizations really have no control over and can't put security controls around. But at the end of the day, the personal information will be released publicly on the data leak sites or criminal forums to really bring out that reputation damage. The detection element here, again, lies in risk monitoring on the dark web to find these exposures in real time. So across all three of these threats, destruction, supply chain compromise, and executive doxing, we keep arriving at the same defensive foundation: visibility. Can you see what's happening on your shared assets? Can you see where your data surfaces where it shouldn't? Can you see when your executives are being targeted? That's really what this comes down to. So let's close with what listeners should actually do with all of this. Brandon, I'll pass it back to you first for the security leaders listening.
Yeah, so for the security leaders, today's conversation is really servicing a few board level risk discussions. And they map directly again to the threats that we've covered. First I'll call out is again the third party and supply chain risk. Every vendor, MSP, partner, etc., with privileged access to your environment represents inherited risk. And most organizations cannot confidently answer the two questions that matter most. Which of those relationships could be used to pivot into our environment? And how do we detect when our data is exposed through that partner? If you can't answer those today, you're carrying unquantified risk that threat actors can activate overnight. Next is executive exposure risk. Doxing isn't a nuisance. It's deliberate, low-cost attack designed to create reputational damage and open the door for follow-on attacks. Your executive's personal information can be harvested and exposed all over the dark web. This is a board-level conversation about protecting the people who publicly represent your organization and the operational risk that creates when this happens. Your morning action: put 30 minutes on your calendar with your security team and ask these questions. First, can we identify every vendor asset with privileged access to our environment? And what data do they hold on our behalf? Second, do we have active monitoring for our executive personnel's information on the dark web? If any answer is we don't know or simply no, you've just identified your highest priority visibility gap.
And I'll pick it up for the practitioners. So there are a couple major priorities that need to be actioned as soon as possible. The first is continuous asset visibility. The supply chain discussion highlighted a root problem: shared assets, including endpoints, accounts, and hosts. These things fall outside your standard coverage controls. A one-time audit won't fix that. What you need is continuous discovery, a tool that's always scanning, always identifying endpoints without EDR coverage or systems without proper logging, and then surfacing them in a way that your team can actually work through them. The second priority is a dark web risk monitoring solution, one that gives your team that early warning. Review your detection systems for exposed credentials from information stealers. And ask yourself, where can we enable automated password resets to ensure an exposed admin account doesn't become a weapon for enterprise-wide destruction? Your morning action: pull your asset coverage report. Ask which hosts are used by third parties. What defenses do we have in place on them? Specifically, look for any endpoints without EDR. Those are your most exposed entry points for a threat actor to pivot into your network.
So here's the line connecting everything that we've discussed today. Iranian-aligned actors are using AI-enhanced malware to identify and weaponize stolen credentials at speed. They're exploiting the gray space between your security program and your third parties, the shared assets that no one's watching. And when they want to cause damage without breaching your network, they're exposing executives' personal information to create chaos. In every case, the defensive need is the same: close the visibility gap before the attacker finds them. That means leveraging AI to keep pace with the threat, using continuous asset discovery to eliminate the blind spots in your environment, and monitoring the dark web in real time for those exposed credentials, leaked data, and executive information. The organizations that bring these three together aren't reacting to the next attack. They're getting ahead of it. And the ones that don't will keep discovering the gaps the same way they always have, after an incident. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of ShadowTalk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcasting platform of choice. And we really appreciate if you can rate and review ShadowTalk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of ShadowTalk.